Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a sheep in graphite. Now I'm going to have a lot of tips in this video on how to draw realistic wool, but before I can get started with that I like to begin with the eye. Now my first priority is to focus on the size and shape of the eye. Once I'm happy with that I can then begin drawing the eye itself. Now here I'm building up my darker values in stages, and I allowed the white of the paper to show through for the initial highlight, which as you've seen here I've darkened in stages. Now this would always be my recommendation if you do have a bright highlight on any part of the drawing, allow the white of the paper first of all to show through, and then it can be darkened later if needed. Now when I worked on the surrounding fur around the eye, this is a very different texture to the wool, so I'm having to make sure that I use my pencils and erasers correctly in order that I'm going to have that variation in texture later on. Now this is something that I do focus the real-time step-by-step tutorial on, because how we use the pencil, how we build up the layers and then use a combination of erasers can give us a range of textures depending on the animal that we're drawing. Now regardless of the animal, the fur texture, whatever it may be, I always want to be focusing on the layering process and capturing good contrast. Now even with this small area drawn in, you can really see how dark I've got the graphite, and that's been able to be achieved with the right layering process. I didn't jump into my darkest pencils first, I've been made sure to really build this up in stages. Now the layering process and the techniques that are required are going to be adjusted depending on the animal that I'm drawing. However, no matter what the subject is, I always like to start off with a layer of graphite powder that I apply with a paper blending stump, or in some cases an eye makeup applicator. Now depending on which method I use is going to again depend on how I want my base layer to look. But what I want to be focusing on here with that first layer is to get a softness in place. I'm only using the graphite powder to hint at my main lights and darks, and you can see that being demonstrated here. The way that I'm really focusing on the placement of the lights and darks is what's going to help with that shape and form that's created. Now the highlights and shadows in where they're placed is not random, they do follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. So if I was to shift the placement of a highlight or shadow, I could then end up dramatically changing the shape of the face. Now of course this means it's not going to resemble that animal as accurately as it could, so this is something that I do focus on right from that base layer stage. Now the other aspect that affects the shape and form is the fur direction. Now just like the highlights and shadows, the fur direction isn't random, that will also follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. So you can see here that when I use a combination of my pencils or erasers, that I'm always making sure that I'm really noticing any subtle change in that direction. Now an example of that is here. You can see how I'm having to curve my pencil strokes over the rounded shape on the bridge of the nose. As it starts to then curve down towards the cheek, all of these exaggerated fur directional changes are for a reason, and of course the fur directional change is going to be unique for each individual animal. So this is actually one of my own sheep, and I have two of this exact breed, yet they both look quite different in terms of their face structures. So it's something that I really want to be focusing on with any portrait that I create. Now another aspect of drawing realistic fur, feathers, whatever it may be, is the length and thickness of the pencil and eraser details. Now depending on the erasers that you're using, whether or not it be a Tombow mono eraser, a battery eraser, a putty eraser, the technique is going to have to be adjusted depending on the tool that you're using. But what I want to do in this situation is to have my highlights looking similar in terms of the length and thickness to match my pencil strokes. Now this is one aspect of working with graphite that I'm more frequently asked, so it's therefore something that I do cover thoroughly in all of my step-by-step lessons. Being able to control, for example here, a Tombow mono eraser in the same way as a pencil, so that I've got that correct balance between the similarities of my highlights and darker pencil strokes, is all in the technique and how we're using it. However, one of my biggest tips when using a Tombow mono eraser is not to use too much pressure. Now I think this is something that we have a tendency to do when using an eraser because we're trying to lift the graphite off, especially over dark areas as I am here. But the problem with using more pressure is that you end up creating a thicker highlight. So my preference would be to continue to use the same movement across that highlight where I want it to be in place and try to remove that graphite in layers rather than trying to use more pressure and then remove it all of a sudden. So using lighter pressure and then sticking with the movement to remove more of that graphite is usually my go-to method. Now, if you do have any questions about using a Tombow mono eraser or any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. Now, contrast is something that I've already mentioned at the beginning of this video, but you can see here where I was going back in and darkening sections on her face, how much more of a three-dimensional shape that's helped to create. Now, contrast is crucial. This is what's going to make that portrait look more realistic. We can have thousands of individual details within one area, but if the values and contrast isn't right, it's still going to look flat. So I always want to be focusing on the contrast as well as the details and how they're built up. Now here's an example. If I was to leave it at this stage, this section of her mouth does not look as realistic as it does when I continue to build the layers and make it darker and exaggerating more of my highlights. It's this that's helping to create more of that three-dimensional structure. Now, when it came to working on her ears, I did have to adjust my technique slightly. Now, this ear was a little bit out of focus, so I wanted to make sure that I didn't force too many details. Now, as always, I'm using graphite powder here first, and once I've hinted at my lights and my darks, this is when I can then come back in with my pencils and refine everything. Now, I'm starting with my outer edge so that I can get that softness in place first. I don't want to make my edges too blurry because that's going to make the ear look far more out of focus than it should be, but I do want to make sure that it's a little bit softer. Now, in order to create this effect, this is why I love using graphite powder. As well as my base foundation, it just really does provide that initial softness, which for a technique like this can speed up that process. Now, if you don't like using graphite powder, then you can do something similar with your pencils. I would recommend to start off with a much lighter layer and then soften the edges of the pencil strokes you create, do more of a shading technique, and then build those values up more gradually. Get a little bit darker with each layer that you apply. Now, when it came to drawing the wool is quite a complex texture because it can be quite confusing to look at in the reference photo. It's definitely one of those textures where we can look at the photo and think, where do I start? Now, I know that if I have that feeling, I want to be breaking up into even more layers than I typically would. This is going to simplify the process even more. Now, this is one aspect that I do cover thoroughly in the real-time step-by-step tutorial. If this or any of my other lessons are of interest, then I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. Now, I think my first tip when drawing wool would be to focus on a good base foundation first. Don't jump into drawing the texture of the wool as your first layer. Now, when I first worked with my graphite powder, again, just like when I worked on the face, I'm only putting in my main lights and darks. I'm allowing the white of the paper to show through for some of those lighter sections of highlights, and then I can come back in with my pencils to make sense of the layers that I've put in with my graphite powder. Now, the layers of graphite powder, it is helping us to not have that large area of blank space. So being able to map in the variations, the shapes within the wall, the shadows, the main highlights, just means that we're less likely to feel overwhelmed with that drawing process. Now, this aspect is something that I'm going to continue to explain further when I work on the rest of the wall for the face and the body. But going back to the ear, you can see here just how much darker this side is. Now, when we're looking at these in comparison with the left ear and the right ear, you can really see now how the left side is significantly lighter, and it also helps to create that impression that that ear is a little bit further away from the camera than her other ear. So this is going to help massively with the depth that's achieved with the portrait. Now, starting with the wool again, here I'm using a medium-sized paper blending stump just to apply my graphite powder. Now, what I've done here first of all is to simplify the process as much as I can, is I'm focusing just on a few of the darker areas first. If I can put those in initially, then I'm not going to get as confused with the drawing process. So I'm always trying to simplify it as much as I can, especially when with a complex texture like this. Now, another way that I personally find I'm more efficient and effective with how I work is I like to break it up into small sections. So I'm only focusing on the section of wall underneath her eye. I'm not trying to do the neck and her body all at the same time. Now, because this was very much a rinse and repeat technique process, if I personally work on too much of a larger area, I know that I'm going to skip through important stages. Now, if this is something where you don't experience that, you prefer working in whole individual layers, then of course that's absolutely fine. But if you do feel that you're hesitating, you're not quite sure where you should be, then that's an indication that the area you're trying to work on is too big. I would recommend to scale that down 1 or 2 inches if you need to. And again, with this entire section, you can see I've split it up into 2 sections. I worked on the top part closer to the eye, and then I'm now working on the lower section. So it is just something where we can then only focus on that one area. We're not having to then absorb all of that information in the reference photo, and we're just more likely to then work through in a bit more of a methodical way. It just helps for us to not have as much of that stress and anxiety through that drawing process. Now, one of the other things that I found made it more easier to draw this complex texture was noticing the shapes that the wall created. Now, what I mean by that is the wall underneath her eye, that bit here is more of a rounded, softer look, whereas the wall just below it, it's creating more of those darker lines, almost rectangular shapes. Being able to observe where it changes here is going to help with the structure and the realism within the wall. Now, what happens here is whether or not the wall changes from more of the darker lines, sort of similar to how I'm working here, that's going to help make it look like she's got her head turned away. So just like the fur direction on her face, the way that the wall is structured here isn't random. It's doing this slight change in shaping because of how her head is turned. So this was something that I really did want to focus on because the shapes and the size of each of those segments was going to help have more of that realistic look depending on the area of her face that I was working on. Now, as I start to continue on the body, this is where all of the shaping of the wall is going to make more sense. Now, the sides here was more of those narrower lines, and then as we worked on the centre of her body, you can see that they open up more. They're a little bit more of those wider rectangular shapes. Now, there are a couple of reasons why this is so important, but the first is that the lighter edges here of her body are going to create the impression that it is going further away from the camera. If we have the wider shapings here that we're drawing in the centre, if they are on the sides, then we're going to have a really flat look to the front of her body. It won't look like it curves around her shoulders and down her rib cage. So this is why when I was drawing the wall, I was only really focusing initially on the shapes that I could see. It made it much easier to draw this wall in more of this realistic style because I wasn't allowing myself to focus on the details too soon. By breaking this up into individual layers, small sections, and the shapes that I could see, it just meant that this was looking more realistic, faster, and the entire section of the wall aspect of this portrait was actually quicker than the time it took for me to draw her entire face. So first of all, just focusing on the shapes and then refining the lights and the darks before I considered any details is definitely one way that I think works really well for drawing this complex texture. And then once I had the structure of the wall in, I was then able to refine my contrast. I was then able to add in the details. It really did simplify this entire piece. So I do hope that this tutorial was useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to this or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. If you have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.